more minutes while we wait for the last few people to join. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. We're really excited to have you. I think this will be quite an exciting session. There's a poll in the chat, and I will reshare because Francois says that he can only see the result and not share, not vote. Please share the link again. Okay, I will do that. I've reshared the poll. It's in the chat. If you could also please mute your microphone if you haven't done so already, and we'll start in 2 minutes when everyone has completed the poll and given the last few people the opportunity to join.
She's so
Okay, hi everyone. We'll start in 30 seconds. Thanks again for joining. Hi everyone. I think we can start. Thanks for joining us again as part of the Performance Standard series. We're really grateful for everyone who's participated in these sessions, who's provided insights, and to those who have been presenters. It's really valuable for us to be able to allow different consultants to present at these sessions and to just share their insights and knowledge around how to apply the performance standards. So today we're looking at Performance Standard 5, the biggest and the baddest of all the performance standards, the one that strikes the fear of God into many project developers, and also to me as a consultant. It's probably one of the more, if not the most controversial performance standard. So unsurprisingly, we had quite a lot of interest in this session. So thank you again for joining. We have quite a packed agenda today. So I'm just going to do a really quick introduction to the Performance Standard 5, speak quickly about the topics covered and the objectives. And then I'm going to hand over to Alex from Community Insights, who's very kindly offered to walk us through the performance standard in detail, the different aspects of it, what it really requires. There is a lot of complicated language in Performance Standard 5, and hopefully she's going to sort of demystify the requirements for us somewhat. And she asked me to warn you specifically that today's session is very interactive. And she said, you know, Ben, I'm going to make them think. So I hope no one was planning on cruising through their emails and checking the News 24 website while Alex was presenting. We're trying to make this the most interactive session possible. After Alex, and we'll then have a short break, and then we're going to hand over to Greg Huggins, who is a consultant specializing in resettlement and social issues, and he's going to speak a little bit about his practical experience of applying Performance Standard 5 to projects on the ground, and some of the lessons learned that he has from working on difficult resettlement types of issues. And then Prab has very kindly agreed to join us. She is in the Environmental and Social Risk Management Department at Standard Bank here in Johannesburg. And she has very kindly agreed to speak briefly about some of her experiences from a banker's perspective or an investor's perspective around how Performance Standard 5 types of issues can derail projects and cause headaches. And then we're going to wrap up with a really short video that Nomfundo and Alex are going to discuss. Again, a big thanks to Alex, who actually shared this video with us, and it was Community Insights who have provided an abbreviated version. So a really packed agenda for this afternoon, but it is, I think, probably the performance standards that does have the most significant issues. So we hope that you'll find the session valuable. At the end, there will be a survey. Again, we really do encourage you to complete it. And the feedback is not just important to help us improve future sessions, but we also use the data to report to our investors into this program. So the more people that we can show are satisfied and happy with the training we provide them, the more chance that we have to get further funding to provide similar sessions in the future. So just really quickly around the objectives of Performance Standard 5 before I hand over to Alex in 2 or 3 minutes. So as I'm sure everyone knows on this call, Performance Standard 5 is really around resettlement and economic displacement issues. So when communities are impacted by projects and are forced to move or lose their livelihoods. So that is really what we are speaking about today. This performance standard really provides guidance to project developers and investors around how to avoid displacing people, how to try and minimize the impacts of displacement if there is no alternative to moving people, and how to minimize and avoid impacts associated with moving people. In turn, it speaks a lot about compensating people effectively and how to manage resettlement processes in a transparent and fair manner. There is also a lot of focus on how to restore and even improve people's livelihoods after resettlement has taken place, how to get their lives back up and running again by providing them with adequate housing and security of tenure at resettlement sites. And this is a very interesting issue that comes up at the video at the end of today's session. So we really hope that you will be able to join us for the whole session today, and that you'll find it valuable. This is just a quick slide on the topics that are covered. But I think I've touched on them mostly. So we're talking about how to design projects to minimize resettlement impacts, compensation, community engagement, grievance mechanisms, and restoring people's livelihoods. We'll also have some discussions around how to manage private sector developments where the government will lead the resettlement process. So lots of very big and complicated issues. Land in Africa, as we all know, is a very delicate and challenging issue very much linked to people's livelihoods in the development of Africa. So we hope that you'll be able to find today's session beneficial. I think the final note is everyone has their own unique presentation styles, but please do not hesitate to put any questions or comments in the chat. We will be looking out for them and we'll be sure to try and answer everybody's questions. Alex, I'm going to stop sharing and I'm going to hand over to you. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to present today. And I think she's going to use quite an innovative way of presenting through Mentimeter. So Alex, over to you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me well. I've just posted a comment on the chat. I would like to ask everybody to please open a web browser and just follow the instructions as you have them there. Go to menti.com. You need to enter that code and please keep the browser visible. I'm also going to share my screen so everybody can see the presentation live. But it's important that for you to interact with me during the presentation, that you have the browser visible, so you can quickly respond to questions, add comments as we go along, and then also you can see my presentations, which will show mostly of the outcomes and the different discussions we'll be having. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Can I check, Ben? Can you see my shared screen? Good.
You can see your shared screen, we can hear and we can see you.
Okay, and then has everybody managed to go into Menti?
I'm in, Alex. I've also put a message in the chat that if anyone has any troubles logging in, they can just message me and I'll sort you out separately so we don't have any disruptions.
Perfect, not a problem. So I think I'm just going to introduce myself with, well, everybody just logs in. Please pop a message if you can't. So I'm Alexandra Constantinidi and I work for Community Insights Group. I'm a resettlement and livelihood restoration specialist. I've been working in South Africa and South America for the last 13 years. It is my passion. It is really what I like doing. And at the moment, I think it's my key work. I'm busy only with LRPs and resettlement plans. Community Insights Group is a global consultancy. We're specialized in social consulting and human rights. And I just wanted to share with you this piece of art that we got from a South African artist. She has depicted a global socio-ecological system which is under pressure, and this is the place where we live in right now. So I welcome you to have a look at it in detail on our website. It's beautiful. Have a look at the website of the artist. She's amazing. And I think this kind of helps us to start the conversation about resettlement and land acquisition processes. So if everybody's logged into the Menti, I see I've got some players. Let's see, we've got 19 people on board. Wonderful. So the first question is just for everybody. Look at your browser, your mobile device. What is the correct name of Performance Standard 5? We just mentioned it. So you've got, sure, 15 seconds. Sorry about that. Quick. All right. Perfect. Can everybody see the results on my screen? So land acquisition and involuntary resettlement. So this is how Menti works. If this is the first time you're using Menti, we're going to have a few slides. We're going to have a quick conversation, and then every couple of slides, I'm going to ask you a question. This is your next question. Tell us about your experience on land acquisition and PS5. I know that you have asked one question. So please go ahead, tell me, have you never took part? Have you been, reading some reports? Have you been performing monitoring? Yes, just let me know. This will be great for our conversation. This is wonderful. Very good. Okay, so 26% on active participation, 55% on reading materials, so getting familiar with due diligence or RAPs, that's really good experience as well. And if you never took part in the land acquisition process, it might not be really your expertise area, but you might have heard of it. So I hope that the presentation today will give you some light on the process. Thank you, everybody. So the agenda for today has 6 points. I'm going to try to run through it. If you wanted to know absolutely everything about the standard, go ahead, open the standard, you can read it. What I'm going to try and put here is just a different point of view, and also to show you and walk you through the different challenges of PS5, and what is best practice, what actually happens on the field, put some reality on this. So my titles, you'll see they're not standard. And I've just tried also to pull in a little bit of a people's perspective. So we're talking about people, we're talking about livelihoods, people's lives, human rights. So you'll see throughout my presentation, this is about people. It's not about the company, it's not about the project, it's not about the financiers, this is about people's life. So we're gonna take that approach from this part, which is the approach that actually IFC takes. So a better understanding starts at school. So this is a picture of the kids in Mozambique. This is a classroom that is made out of tree stands, tree poles, and the kids are looking at you, hoping that you will pay attention. And this is just key concepts for you to grasp a little bit. So basically, what is PS5? It is a guide for mitigation. When you identify that your impact is displacement, the best place to go to is to a standard that can tell you what is best practice, what is expected of best practice, what do we do with this displacement. So basically PS5 should be a guide for you, for the developer, for the consultant, for anybody trying to understand how do we mitigate, how do we avoid. And if we can't avoid it, then let's do the best possible for both the community and the project. So here I'm just trying to show that you will have a mitigation plan for those impacts that you found between the social context and the project design. I just named a few, which are the most common ones in our literature that most likely everybody will be familiar with. Loss of land and crops, loss of access to natural resources, loss of housing. But in reality, if you ask the impacted people to do a community-based social impact assessment, they might actually come up with different questions, and they will be the best people to identify their own impacts. So just consider it. It's a good approach, especially when you're talking about livelihoods. So key concepts, this is all long and boring, so we're just going to go through key what you need to know. A livelihood is simply everything a household needs to make a living. So you, me, everybody in this chat room, we all have a livelihood. We all depend on the resources. We all depend on our families and friends. We've got loans, we've got credit, we've got assets. We all do. Poor people, rich people, we all have a livelihood. And in order for us to understand what are we displacing, we need to understand that livelihood. So that's usually your socioeconomic baseline, which is very simply put. You can talk about methodology. There's plenty of methodology about how to run this survey, socioeconomic baseline, the cutoff date. A lot of information goes into this understanding the livelihood. But basically, what we need to understand is what are we losing, what are we impacting. So physical displacement refers to the loss of housing. Resettlement is the plan of that process of relocating people and communities. Economic displacement refers to a situation where people's houses are not directly impacted, but the loss of other assets impacts their economy. Obviously, we immediately think of just land and crops, but we can also think about bee harvesting. We can think about natural resources collection, fisheries. So a livelihood restoration plan is a group of specific allowances or activities intended to support displaced people's efforts to improve or at least restore. And again, I'm going to here make an emphasis on the efforts, because it doesn't mean that you have to provide or spoon feed anybody. It means that you have to provide the context for the household to recover, whatever that context means. And our resettlement policy framework, it's sometimes forgotten, And it's a very key important instrument, and I wish it was mandatory from the IFC that every project has a framework. But the framework is usually comes in when there's not enough detail and we're not certain if this project will go ahead. And in the case that if, big if, we will go ahead with a RAP. We do a framework that will actually outline the general principles of what we will do in the future. But this is amazing planning for the investors, for the board of directors of a company. It's great because it has to pin down principles that are, at the end of the day, translated into commitments. So just think about framework. You can also find it on the PS5. It's all well detailed. So let's just talk about voluntary and involuntary, because we just mentioned that the name of this PS5, it's involuntary resettlement. So this means that affected people cannot refuse the land acquisition, regardless of the efforts. It means that whoever is acquiring the land has a greater power over them, and they will not have the right to say no. So in any other case, it is a voluntary situation where people have an informed consent, but also the power of choice. So you might think of a willing buyer, willing seller situation, which is perfectly fine, but you might also need to think in which situation people can refuse and they have the right to say no. So I'm going to ask you again to look at your Menti, and we're going to run through a question again. Let's just see. What is a willing buyer, willing seller situation? I'm going to present you with three. The noise is so bad, they want to leave anyway. They need the money and we're paying double. They don't want to sell, so we better move the turbines to a new location. Okay, so they don't want to sell, so the wind turbines will have to move. They said no, you can't do anything else. Negotiation has gone as far as you could. You don't have a right of way. Your project doesn't have one. The wind turbine could be anywhere where it's best possible for wind and other situations. But in reality, if you need your wind turbine in the location of a farmer and the farmer said no, you don't have right of way. So I think the situation that they need the money and we're paying double, it doesn't mean that it's a willing buyer and willing seller. It's about the choice. So just remember, forget about the situation. It's about the choice. Can they say no? So just something to think about. Let's talk about principles. What's beneath the surface? And this is something interesting because I think that when PS5 hits and PS5 it's triggered, people run after implementing and doing things. And we forget about principles. And I think this is important. I'm going to talk a little bit about it, and I'm glad that Ben introduced us to it. So I'm not going to go through the avoid, and improve. But it's basically that whenever possible, the project sponsor should avoid or minimize the displacement. And this happens at the very beginning of project, when there is project design and project alternative sites. So has there been a decision about the site for this project in terms of people's impacts? So this is really important. If you don't want PS5 to be triggered, then you need to look at PS5 triggers right at the beginning of your scoping phase. Even when this is just a concept project, you have to look at it. Otherwise, you might run or you might not run into this problem. But if you can avoid, or even if you've got a bigger piece of land, government gave you a bigger piece of land and your project requires a smaller piece of land, where is the best location for your facility within that land that will minimize the impact, that will minimize the displacement? So this is very important for PS5. PS5 key principles, long list, but if you have to go and apply PS5 and PS5 triggers, it applies. You really need an expert to come and help you out. The first thing you need to look at is your principles. Can you commit to these principles? Do you have the budget? Do you have the expertise? So I'm not going to go through all of them, but basically, compensation will be a full replacement cost. Government might tell you, no, we've got a rating, don't worry, we're going to have here, there is already a published list of prices, wonderful, thank you very much, we will consider it, but because I'm applying PS5, full replacement value applies. Vulnerable people will be provided with targeted assistance. We need to identify them first. And secondly, we need to make sure we consult enough with them to understand that they will not fall into worse hardship after displacement. So in this sense, I'm going to ask you again to participate with me. What is a good resettlement plan? One that looks at resettlement as development opportunity. There's no right or wrong here. One that only complies with local land acquisition legislation, one that compensates all losses with cash, or the one that focuses on people's well-being. I'm really enjoying the Menti. Thank you. I can see everybody's participating very nicely. This is great. So perfect. I would also agree. I think that one that looks at resettlement as a development opportunity, it's actually something that IFC encourages, and the one that focuses on people. Perfect. I agree with you. So very quickly, respect for human rights also applies. And if something that perhaps IFC doesn't go into depth, and you won't find the relationship between PS5 and human rights as a requirement or a principle, but when applying PS5, you can actually see how many human rights actually need to be respected. So this chart is showing you for importance, they're all important, but in importance and in a scale of perhaps of violation or disrespect. The first two will be an adequate standard of living and private and family life. And here we're talking about surveys. When you go and ask all those questions to all those families because you want to have a beautiful report about their socioeconomic situation and context, it takes a really strong heart to go and ask all those questions. So privacy, also the right to say no, self-determination. If I don't want to talk to you, if I don't want to disclose information, if I don't want to participate, or if I want to participate, I should be able to decide. So just think about the human rights that actually are involved, rights of the children. So when you're displacing families and a physical displacement, what happens within the week before and the week after when the family is moving? Can kids still go to school? Would that be interrupted? Well, we need to look into it because we might be actually jumping into a little bit of problems here. Right, reality planning. Perhaps this is how the beautiful plan looks like when you look at IFC and you think, oh, I'm just going to draft a beautiful plan. But actually, when you start implementing a PS5 or resettlement process, this is actually what happens. And actually, just before you are in the final line, starts raining. So let's look into planning a little bit. It all starts with hello. It all starts with meeting people. It starts with communicating, with community engagement, identifying the stakeholders. You can open the entire book about how to do, meaningful engagement, participatory, prior, free, informed consent, any methodology you would like to apply. Whatever it takes, it needs to start as early as possible, but also you need to manage expectations. Big important part of a PS5 is consultation all throughout. A lot of developers go away, make up solutions, think, plan, come back, and they want to socialize the solutions and just get perhaps their approval. With PS5, it's a two-way, constantly, from beginning to end. For the consultant, the financier, the project proponent, the government, they cannot work alone. They have to work with the impacted people. So I think it's important to consider that, and this also in PS5, you will see that it's encouraged that you develop a stakeholder engagement plan specifically for the land acquisition process. And that the grievance redress mechanism is not just the general one for the project, it has to be brought down to land claims, because maybe a construction site accident or complaint cannot be treated with the same severity or urgency as a land claim. So very important, if you've got a grievance redress mechanism, go check if you've got a resettlement plan, if it's brought down to land claims and all type of issues related to livelihoods. So this is pretty much a roadmap. It's a RAP or the LRP. We said the RAP is mostly for physical resettlement and the LRP for livelihood restoration. Most likely, if you have physical resettlement, you might be incurring on economic displacement. And if you only have economic displacement, you don't need a RAP. So they can be both, it can be just one. We will start with the identification of project-induced displacement. This will be your impacts. Assessment, obviously gathering all the information, mitigation design, and this is when you start talking options. Let's find alternatives. You know, can we minimize? Can we avoid? What are the best options? Let's negotiate with the families. What is the compensation agreement? And the compensation agreement, it's an agreement. It means there's two parties agreeing to something. So it's not a compensation form or a compensation, what you call it. You just get a receipt and you say, this is what you get, sign here. This is an agreement. I will come and I will mitigate the problem, but you will participate. You will come and you will talk to me when you have a problem. So it's important that we understand agreements as a both way. In the agreement, you have to state responsibilities for the company and responsibilities for the people that will be involved in that compensation and that livelihood restoration process. Implementation, monitoring and evaluation up to completion audit. It's literally what you need to implement once you have come to an agreement. If it's just your compensation in cash and kind, your resettlement, physical resettlement into the new homes, new villages, until the completion audit, which is tied to your indicators and your indicators of success, which indicates when you will stop your LRP or your RAP because you have concluded and you have therefore restored or improved that loss. So I'll ask you, maybe this is a little bit of a longer one to ask you for, but from an investor point of view, what would you add here? What processes or milestones would you add here? This is because what I'm presenting you is only from the PS5 point of view. This is just for what we need to do in terms of, you know, mitigating, finding solutions. So if anybody has a question or a comment, a milestone, what would you add? What is important for DFS to add here?
Alex, so you're asking if I'm a DFI investor into this project prior to the RAP taking place, what is the milestone that I would want to see for me that the RAP is being conducted in line with the requirements of PS5? Is that the question? Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So perhaps, you know, before the financial institution pays out, you know, an advancement of money, do they need any guarantees? You know, at any part of that process that I just showed you, would you need a warranty? Would you need something that, you know, will secure that financing? Linked to financial close. Mm-hmm. Let me just go back to the slide. So for you to know at mitigation design, we're going to come to an agreement on what we're going to do, which will also give me budget and schedule. Before that, will be very difficult to tell how much is my investment, because we might think that there's land around the corner for replacement, but there is not. We might think that people want to move to the location next door that is empty, but they actually want to go 20 kilometers away. So perhaps our budget, you know, will actually be different after compensation, after the agreements have been signed. Okay, but I'll leave it there. If anybody wants to think about something else around the process and how to link it with your financial, with your financial planning, the completed socioeconomic baseline. Mm-hmm. Perfect. So I'm just showing you an example of timeframes and a little bit of activity planning. The example is for an economic displacement of 100 cassava farmers in Malawi. And we are calculating that it's going to take us about 1 year just to design the compensation of these 100 farmers. This will involve their risk assessment, the initiation of the planning process, meaning it's the initiation of consultations with the communities, asset survey, cut-off day, collection of data, LRP assessment, understanding what are we impacting. So once you get the data, you'll totally understand what you're impacting and what you need to restore. And then you come to a mitigation design that will then lead to your compensation and negotiations and agreements. So we estimate that it's usually around 2 to 3 years that you stay in an LRP process. This one in particular, it's related to one growth cycle of cassava. It's really important to note this because a lot of people say, how long would this take? We don't know. It's project dependent. It's your approach dependent. It's what the people and you have agreed to do in the future. So in this case, it will be 24 months. That's one growth cycle for cassava is 24 months. And then we will do a follow-up for another 12 months. And then we will part ways. Though in those 3 years, the company or the proponent will have an entire plan to make sure that that first cassava planting and harvesting goes well. So this is what we set up. It's my goal. It's the goal we agreed with the community. It's not your goal in your resettlement plan. So can we extrapolate this to another project? No. Please don't take this as, as a standard. This is just an example of how to plan for it. So another point here is LRP closure phase, but also the monitoring that comes to closure. So basically we call it monitoring and evaluation, but we can't evaluate if we don't monitor. So we need to monitor something. So at the end of the day, we can evaluate it. If there hasn't been monitoring and evaluation throughout the entire process, it will be very difficult to have a completion audit. So when does monitoring start? As early as possible, because you have to monitor changes, investments, shocks, anything that will actually impact into your LRP planning and people's lives. So again, big sign here, ongoing consultation throughout. That will never stop. Your CLOs, your community liaison officers with their community engagement supervisor or manager, whoever it is that you make them in charge of the relationship with them, with the impacted households, they will have to be on board during the entire time. So let's do a reality check against my time frame. Halfway through asset survey, encroachers were identified in the land. The village chief requires that all survey stops until this issue is resolved. Let's add 3 months delay. During the identification of replacement land for agriculture, it becomes evident that the only land available nearby will need improvements, inclusive of an irrigation system. It's the only land available. 6 months delay. We need engineering design, we need to bring the water in, we might need an impact assessment about the water collection, etc. Request for more budget. Okay. After 1 year of consultation with all affected households, compensation agreements are ready to be signed. An anti-land grab activist arrives in the area and manages to obtain support from a few households, enough to stop the signature of agreements. 2 months in the best situation that you manage to go back and talk to the few households that are now concerned from what the activists have told them, manage to have a relationship with the activists. They're not the enemy, they are there to look after people's rights. So maybe it's a good opportunity actually to have a new stakeholder on board. 2 months in, families have agreed to the resettlement area where they will move, and company will build agreed assigned houses. When construction starts, families stop the process, demanded that youth are giving job opportunities at the construction site. 1 month delay due to negotiations with youth and unions. So what I'm trying to do with this slide is to show you that even your best planning can also fail, because you're talking about people's lives. You're actually putting your fingers in a political context, in a socioeconomic context. Right now in the middle of a pandemic. So all of these things can actually you can actually impact the planning. I see somebody cannot see the presentation, but I think is everybody all right?
Jaboha, does anyone else have the same issue?
No, I can see it fine.
Okay.
Please
okay,
continue.
I'll go ahead. Okay. So with our shoes, and this is just to talk about risk and drivers. And I found this picture very, it talks by itself. I think the picture really depicts what we're talking about when we're talking about PS5, especially in the African context. So when we're looking at risks, we need to identify the risk for the people first. Then we will look at the risk for the projects and financiers. If we leave the risk for the people at the end, we are risking actually not identifying the risk for the projects adequately. So we need to understand what are we impacting on people. So therefore we can make a project that is suited for avoiding or minimizing displacement. And if you can't avoid it, with the best plan that you can provide. So risk for the projects and financiers, resettlement often causes delays and high additional costs. Strong campaigners like my anti-land grab activists are difficult to deal with and can cause project delays. Possible impact on debt servicing capacity and reputation. The complexity of resettlement is often underestimated. Difficulties to close gaps between international standards and local legal requirements. That is a real problem, especially in countries where land acquisition is legislated in a very different way than IFC requires. Taking shortcuts, not going to go there. The cost of getting social rights is dwarfed by the cost of getting it wrong. So be careful with taking shortcuts. So what are the key challenges of resettlement planning? And this is specifically talking at DFIs and an investment level. Livelihood restoration, more so in rural areas because of worldwide land scarcity. So if you've got a project that needs to acquire land to displace people, look at the land availability first. If there's no land available where people are going to go, then, does this not represent a risk to actually the go ahead of the project? Livelihood restoration must be the key driver for good resettlement planning. The second one will be implementation arrangements and capacity. Arrangements can sometimes be particularly complex, and capabilities are almost always insufficient, if not absent, in government agencies and private corporations, and especially in those countries where there's no legislation that will relate to the land acquisition process that IFC is requiring. So sometimes you might need a resettlement planning, a strong resettlement team that can, contribute towards the different challenges you're going to have. And your organization, so this is more talking about the due diligence process before you invest. You need to ensure that implementation arrangements are specific enough and workable. Are they talking reality? Are they grounded? So sometimes it all looks really nice on paper, but you need to look at the context and the reality of it. And the last one will be obviously budget and time frame. Resettlement is almost always more costly and usually delayed. Individual legal issues, can take also a lot of time. The budgets must be as detailed as possible. So maybe I'm just going to ask you to interact again with me because I've been talking for more than 10 minutes. So what are the important drivers for DFIs to pursue projects with a significant displacement impact? And take your time to think. So you've got 0 to 3. And it's just literally not important, or very important. Just take your time. Okay, this is looking really good. So I will agree that the second statement and the last statement are very important in order to understand, the project context and understand how real can it get? How can we implement this? Can we actually do this? Okay, should I give it a few more seconds? Is everybody fine? We've got 10 people answered. That's a little bit less than before, so I need to wake up the other 5, but there we go, 11. Okay, I talked too much. I should have stopped talking 2 slides ago. Okay, so I'll move forward and then later I'll share all the entire presentation and the results with everybody. So thank you, number 12. You also voted, and 13. That's wonderful. Okay, so I think we're all in agreement that I think the last point is important. 2.5 also client capacity and commitment, definitely very. Okay, perfect. I'll move on. So airing the laundry doesn't mean it's dirty or clean, whichever you want to air, it's okay. But we've got lessons learned, and like Benjamin said, it's really not an easy standard to apply, and it is really a difficult sometimes project to start. When you have it in front of you, you find out the PS5 triggers, what do you do? I think it also, it's important that at that point, you do look back and you ask a consultant to help you understand what has been done before in the place where you're working at, what worked, what didn't work, even before you start thinking about planning for PS5 is really, really important. Context will give you a lot of answers. Here you can share comments at any time. So I just pulled together from a few different reports that are available online. Anywhere you can just access them. There are several non-government organizations that are there looking out for land grabbing issues, especially in Africa. And thanks to them, I think we do get a different point of view, and they also collect a lot of the realities of people on the ground experiencing displacement. You can take it with a pinch of salt, you can agree with them, or you can disagree with them. But sometimes the information they collect is actually, it is intended to open, people's eyes. So this is lesson learned from Southern Africa, risk of impoverishment due to not identified nor measured. So I'm looking at it from a point of view that what happened and why it happened. So unsuccessful change of livelihood base, those programs or those LRPs that they come and said, oh, don't worry, you're going to stop fishing, and now you're going to go and do cattle farming. People have fished for, different generations. It will be very difficult that livelihood-based change will take off unless the person really, really wants to stop fishing. So the best plan usually is not change anything. Sometimes it is just really looking at the risk of impoverishment, and then you will find the answers. So traveling longer distances to the compensation field resulted in increased transportation costs or actually loss of access. Unsuitable grievances and complaint mechanisms, increased discomfort, but also people not feeling heard. So the activist comes and the activist hears, so you're leaving a window open there if you are not listening to the affected people. Limited access to drinking water resulted in worse health conditions. So obviously, we're looking at what went wrong. So don't think that this is the only picture we've got. We do have a lot of ongoing resettlement plans out there in Africa, and they're all, striving and, with challenges, stopped, continue. But I think what it's important to learn from the past is where we don't want to go to. Others have been there, so let's not take our communities there. So let's just see arrogance, large politically driven infrastructure projects with bureaucratic organizations, not listening to the PAPs or experts. Perfect, Lesotho Highlands project. Trying to restore non-existent livelihoods. Yeah. We can talk about consultation, not done properly, top-down planning, perfect. All right, opportunistic settlers, developers who don't get it, project time pressure, out of sync with resettlement processes. Excellent. So if you got another comment, I'm going to move on, but you're welcome to leave it on the chat. Clients wake up too late. Sadly, needs to be done tomorrow. Absolutely. Illegal livelihoods. Okay. Okay. Illegal activities. Specialists underskilled. Underskilled to conduct this work. Yes. Misleading LRPs. You know, they go nowhere. They restore nothing. Government-led processes which don't meet IFC standards, which it doesn't mean that it goes wrong. It just means that sometimes government looks at the land acquisition process from a very different point of view, and not from the livelihood point of view, which that's the IFC approach. No sense of urgency. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. I'll move on. So if you can't see it anymore on your device, you might just be able to go and leave us a comment later. Let's see. Okay, and this one, you need to wake up. This is a quick one. You're going to have 30 seconds to answer. You have 3 or 4. Okay. What is the benefit of reviewing the project design to avoid displacement as much as possible? And there is only one win-win situation in these 3. They're all true, but one is a win-win situation. Let's see. Sure. Okay, we said avoid. So less households impacted by displacement. We don't have to apply PS5 or we're lucky, or we have to apply PS5 to very few households. Less households lose their livelihoods, less households are in distress and an impact. So the win-win situation will be where we don't impact you, you don't impact me. Yes, the project will be cheaper, and yes, we will avoid social conflict, but we're just looking at the win-win situation. Perfect. So I'm just going to show you an example. You can find this information online. This is the Norfund. It's from Norway. It's a European investor. They develop a case study in the central solar Mocuba in Mozambique. And they actually explained the entire process on how it went wrong and how they turn it around. I just summarized it for you here. The government allocated 2 replacement land sites for agriculture. The first site was allocated to vulnerable households, and for me to tell you, it was really nearby to where they used to use farming land. So they gave it to vulnerable houses so they can continue access it easily. The second site was found to be unsuitable for farming, and it was the remaining 168 households that was sent to use that land. Now, what does it mean that it's unsuitable for farming? People just cannot go on with their livelihoods. They just can't use those fields. 2 years later than the initial investment, the project purchased land from an entrepreneur. To mitigate for the longer travel distance, bicycles and shelters at the plots were provided, and improvements were made to the road, and 2 new bridges were built to improve access to the land. So this is just a solar project, a PV solar plant. 2 years later, they built 2 bridges so people can go by bicycle because there's no land available. So lots to think about. This is available. Just go Google it. You'll find it. It's a beautiful report how the Norfund actually, admits that there was little consultation to begin with, that there was little information about the land that they were acquiring for replacement. And they also say how they actually supported the client. They didn't let them go because they did the wrong thing. So I'm going to ask you to tell me, what would you do in this case if you were funding this project? Actively involve your in-house ENS expert, apply more and hardened financing conditions, help improve the bankability of the project, and provide business support, or the reputational risk is too high, you exit. There's no right or wrong, but there's different strategies from your organization that you can take. Perfect. Because these two, I think, will be the ones that are not leading to development. They might go against your own, your own business ethics and the reason why you're actually investing in Africa. So perfect. Thank you so much. Let's just move on. I'm actually at the end of my presentation. I can't believe actually, Ben, I'm making it on time. 3 points to remember, so you don't forget. That's why we remember. Meaningful consultation, start as early as possible and build a lasting relationship. This is key. This is key for any PS5. As soon as you're sure, as soon as you know that this is what's going to happen, start and don't stop consulting. Any land acquisition process needs a management plan. A little one, 3 households, 20 households, 700, 1 hectare, 20 hectares. PS5 applies, PS5 applies. It needs a management plan. Avoid, avoid, and avoid. And that's my final suggestion to consider. Okay, so let's have a look. Who is the winner of our, there we go. Whoever is metal has been the fastest to answer all our questions today. So wonderful, congratulations. Can we know who is this?
People are very shy, Alex. I'm just wondering why Donald Trump didn't win.
Don't be shy. It's amazing. Well done. So you've answered all the questions perfectly well. Everybody else have done wonderful, and you have all participated so nicely throughout the presentation. I really enjoyed it. Sorry, I don't think we have a lot of time for questions, but I think I'll ask you a lot of questions already, all of you. But if anything, I think, Ben, if you want to open it for comments.
So I think, Alex, why don't we take a 10-minute break now? Let's join at 10 past. And then we can do 5 minutes of questions when we rejoin at 10 past 3. But maybe to help Alex prep for the questions, could you please just pop your questions in the chat so Alex can give us the most professional answer possible. And then we're going to hand over to Greg. So just rejoin. It's 2:58 now, so let's just start again at 3:08. I'm going to make myself a coffee. Thanks everyone. Alex, that was an absolutely wonderful presentation, extremely insightful. You're a rock star, and we'll rejoin in 10 minutes. Thanks everyone for your time.
Okay. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. We're going to restart in 1 minute. I don't see any questions in the chat. So if you do have a question, please pop it in the chat. Otherwise, we'll hand over directly to Greg. I will give it another minute or two before we restart. Again, a big thanks to Alex for such a fantastic presentation.
Ben, can I try and upload my presentation in the meantime?
Yeah, sure, Greg. Please share your screen. Let's just see if it works. Good idea. Greg, I don't see it yet. By the mute button, there's a share content button, and that's what you want to use. Any luck, Greg? Greg, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Okay, you're not seeing it yet?
No. Otherwise, I can. Yeah.
Seeing quite a lot of other ones. Let me just go out of that. Is that coming up yet?
No. So have you pressed the share content button in the right-hand corner? It's right by the leave button.
Yes, I have. Yeah, I have. Yeah. But for some reason, it's not allowing me to have a look at the.
Yeah. You know what? Why don't you sent me your presentation. I can just share it my side, Greg, and when you want the slide to change, I will do it for you.
All right, let's try that. I don't know why it's not.
No problem.
Let me just go out of that leave again, and then I'll try and load it again. Let's try it once. Okay, let's see if this is going to help.
Greg, happy to share on my side if it's easier.
Okay, yeah, it doesn't seem to. For some reason, it's not allowing me to go into that. I've tried it twice now. Maybe I need control. Do I need control? No.
You should be able to do it yourself, but
yeah.
Don't worry. Let me do it. Give me a sec. It is presentation.
Okay.
Do you see it, Greg?
Yeah, I've got it. Okay, is that yours or mine? Because it looks like it was working on my side as well. Okay.
No.
All right. Good.
Just let me know when to change the slide.
Sure. Okay. Good. All right. Is everybody back on the call? Can I start?
I think so. Go for it, Greg.
Okay.
And if you want to share your video, if you're feeling brave.
Yeah, let me just share the video. I did share just now, just for a minute, just so I don't necessarily have the best of internet connectivity here out in the Hamadulas. So sometimes the bandwidth doesn't play ball. So anyway, I'll share some video just to start off with, and if it gets problematic, then
Sure.
I'll switch it off. Okay. All right. Good. Okay. So so my name is Greg Huggins. Largely a resettlement, I wouldn't call it expert. I don't believe anybody ever becomes really an expert in resettlement. I'm maybe a resettlement practitioner who kind of learns on the job is perhaps a better way of putting it. But I've been doing resettlement for about 25 to 30 years now, largely in guises associated with certainly kind of the World Bank standards to start off with, the old OD and then the OP and then PS5 and those good things. So I have been working on resettlement for about, as I say, about 25 years, and I've worked largely in Africa, a little bit of work outside of Africa in the Southeast Asia and Asia Pacific as well, but mostly in Africa. So really I'm just going to share, I think, some thoughts and some, let's call them sort of tips and tricks that have crossed my path over the last years. And it's by no means a comprehensive list. It's just the sort of things that are, I think, maybe preying on my mind at the moment that I've tried to highlight, but also perhaps things that are kind of topical. So Ben, if you want to go to the next slide. Okay, so a couple of topics. I'm hoping we'll have a little bit of time at the end of the session for people to be able to ask questions. If you really want to interrupt me and ask a question, highlight the raise your hand, and I'm certainly kind of happy to listen to questions and maybe answer things as we go along. But it's best as possibly to leave it to the end. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about land tenure and talk a little bit about land access and gatekeepers. I'm going to talk about legislation and the management of government requirements. Alexandra did sort of touch on that, and it is quite a problematic issue in many respects. So I'll get to that just now. I'm going to talk a little bit about government land-led acquisition, largely because that's an issue that I'm dealing with in probably 3 projects that are current in my life at the moment. It's becoming more and more problematic. I'll talk a little bit about sort of census, valuation, baseline, cutoff dates, because I think those are quite important things to communicate. And I'll talk a little bit about data collection and management. I'll talk a little bit about consultation, and then I've got a list of tricky issues. I've picked up 5 or 6 of those, what we call sort of tricky issues that I'll talk about. We do run a more comprehensive training course from time to time, and we have a list of about 20 of those tricky issues that we deal with, but I've picked a couple of them to sort of concentrate on today. Okay, Ben, I think maybe the next slide. Okay, let me just start off by talking, perhaps given that we're in South Africa and to a South African audience, about land tenure in South Africa, because it might be familiar to most people. So South Africa is reasonably unique in Africa in that it has probably a bigger contingent of land within the land surface that is freehold. And freehold generally applies to most land bar the tribal trust areas. When we're dealing with land access for projects and they're located in freehold land, it's generally relatively simple, comparatively simple, but not also without its complexities. Things like ESTA come into play, things like land restitution, land reform come into play. And I just wanted to talk very briefly about one of the projects that we did recently, which was developed under the guise of the IFC's PS, largely because of the Equator principles being applied by lenders. It was a government project, but it was one of those government projects run by the TCTA, the Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, who basically who develop projects kind of off of the government fiscus. So Springgrove Dam was developed, and it was initially the resettlement, the land access issues didn't look terribly problematic. It was all commercial farms, largely dairy farms, and it was regarded as sort of pretty much a fait accompli that generally kind of land expropriation would deal with the issues. But it soon became evident that we needed to dig deeper into it. And in actual fact, with respect to laborers, farm workers, and also people with Esther rights. It actually became quite a complex project to unlock in the end, and it really needed to go through eventually a full resettlement action plan with a livelihood restoration plan planning process. So even though it looked from the outset that it'd be fairly straightforward, it actually became quite complex. Tribal trust land in South Africa is fraught with complexity, and I think there's sort of two issues that are current in the media at the moment that give sort of real credence to the complexity of that. One is the Kolobeni project, which I'm assuming many people will be familiar with from reading the news, and the other is the Somkeli project, which has become really a fairly hot topic at the moment. And the tribal trust areas essentially are complicated by the fact that you often have competing political entities and interests within the tribal areas, the traditional authorities themselves, but political entities that are linked to various of the political parties through the wards and the councillor system, and perhaps the members of parliament as well, and they don't necessarily have aligned visions for the way in which land access is going to be granted. The default for the traditional authorities quite often to overplay their position does lead to kind of complexities as well, particularly within a situation where in certain areas those traditional authorities actual authority agenda or authority limits are highly challenged. So that does become a real issue as well. Sorry, I see Prova's waiting. Okay. There's also issues around micro land transactions that take place, PTOs within those tribal authority areas, and the actual kind of final adjudication as to who has authority over that land gets really quite complicated in some situations. Civil society often gets involved in these issues as well, and that sometimes leads to a situation where things become more transparent on one hand, but sometimes more complex and antagonistic on the other hand. So land tenure with projects in the tribal trust areas can become extremely complex to try and work with, as I think kind of some developers, particularly developers within the extractive sector, have found out to their cost. Okay, Ben, maybe the next slide. Within what I've called SSA, Sub-Saharan Africa, where really a lot of my additional experience rests, you find freeholders comparatively rare. And the land access situation there is generally very complex. It's complicated by a post-colonial setup. You had a traditional land tenure system that was in place. You had superimposed on that a colonial system in the vast majority of areas, which tended to confuse more than kind of to coordinate the land tenure system. So you have a situation where you had a complicating colonial setup, and in the post-colonial setup, unfortunately, it hasn't got much more simple or much less complex. You often have dual or multiple land tenure systems that are overlapping, traditional and communal tenure, sometimes intermingled with systems that have been imposed in the post-colonial era, largely around kind of land reform projects or tenure reform projects that make land access quite confusing. So understanding the limits of who actually has authority to land in many of those areas becomes really quite complex. This is also compounded by the lack of a systematic cadastral register of land titles. South Africa is fairly unique in its freehold systems, where you have sophisticated cadastral land use sophisticated cadastral systems with a generally well-equipped deeds office and registrar. That's comparatively rare in many other parts of Africa as well. It tends to be not so problematic in the urban areas, but certainly in the rural areas it becomes complex. And boundaries in terms of people's land holdings tend to be descriptive boundaries rather than cadastral title deeds. And that again creates complexity in terms of negotiating land access, but also complexity in terms of negotiating compensation as well. And then multiple overlapping land rights and interests are really not uncommon. And the one project, one country that we found is particularly problematic tends to be Zambia. There's probably a couple of other countries that have similar systems, but Zambia tends to be really quite complex. And we basically dealing with a wind farm at the moment. So it's a renewable energy project, a wind farm, where we've been pulled in to try and sort out the resettlement and livelihoods aspects. And the first thing that's become apparent is that the developer has assumed that the tribal authority in the area has the sole and exclusive right to dispose of land, and has proceeded to negotiate on that basis. And in that, the developer is sadly mistaken. So it's become a real problem. If you want to go to the next slide, Ben, I think there should be just a slide on queues. Well, let's actually talk about that slide first. Okay, I'll go back to that one. That's fine. Okay, sorry. Okay, so let me talk about that one first, the map. Okay, so just to kind of give you a sense of just how complex land in Zambia and land access and negotiating land access permissions can become in Zambia. I picked up a map. This is a project that we did. We did a due diligence for a big commercial farming entity. If you have a look at that map, you can see center pivots, where, you know, if you see center pivots in South Africa, you assume that there would be freehold land in place. And in this instance, there is actually some freehold land in place, but most of it is leasehold. Over and above that, there's also kind of competing interests in terms of the legitimacy of those leases and the way in which those leases were granted. There's also, in between the leased land, there is communal land. And within the communal land, there's two subsets of communal land. There's land that is being held under leases that are being granted by the traditional authority to people who have individualized leases, and there's land as well that is regarded as communal in that it has no individualized ownership at all. So the land situation there is really, really complex, and trying to unpack a legacy situation where we needed to go back and revisit how resettlement took place and people were dispossessed, because there was a lender or a financier who was coming in who wanted to ensure that the PS5 had been dealt with to a reasonable extent, became intensely complicated. Okay, if you want to maybe go to the next slide, Ben, that'd be great. Okay, so I've sort of wanted to introduce the next section just with a kind of a slide that we've developed that takes you through just how complicated sometimes the land access situation can become, and how you really need to kind of take into consideration a number of planning steps in order to be able to understand how you best proceed. I don't want to go into this so much. I'm quite happy to share these slides afterwards. If people want to have a look at it and get back to me with questions, I'd be quite happy to do it. But quite often you have actually a parallel system running in terms of land access. You have a situation where you're having to follow local legal codicils or legal requirements to unlock your land acquisition and your land access, but you also have to comply with a lender or an investor's requirements. And in this instance, we're assuming those would be the IFC requirements. And those tend to then create their own set of complexity. So Ben, if you want to go to the next slide, I'll start talking about some of those in a little bit more detail. Okay, so access permissions, obviously you've got government and you've got national legislation, and you have to abide by national legislation. There's no argument around that. If you are running a land access project that is a land access program that is running counter to national legislation, to government legislation, then you're on breach of legal codicils, and you'd be held accountable to that. So it's not doable. You've also got national government and agencies, particularly environmental agencies. They often want to see that the land access and involuntary resettlement issues are handled, and their first port of call is often to default back to national legislation. So you'll be faced with a series of criteria that you need to comply with that are coupled to national legislation and enforced by the environmental agencies. And those national agencies generally have capacity issues. They're very seldom in a situation where they can respond in a manner that is to the liking of particularly sort of impatient developers. So you have those capacity constraints, but they also quite often are subject to political pressure, particularly where you have a project that is of national importance and is regarded as having political support, and they want the land access issues sorted out within the defined parameters of natural legislation, and they're not particularly interested in anything that the lenders may want. So that does create a sense of competing urgencies and competing requirements as well. Then we have local leaders. We touched on that a little bit before, but you have local leaders, and you quite often have multiple and overlapping roles where you have traditional and communal tenure is involved, but you also have political entities and political interests, and those don't always coincide. Where that happens again, there is the potential for land access to become quite a convoluted and complex aspect to negotiate. You have gatekeepers, and I'll just refer back to that, the unfortunate incident of the wind farm in Zambia, where essentially you had a gatekeeper, which is essentially the local authority, and you had the developer who assumed that because they had, I wouldn't say bought off the local authority, because I think that would be disingenuous. They didn't go that far. Certainly wasn't. It wasn't an intentional kind of bribe or anything like that, but it was a situation where they thought they had bought goodwill of the gatekeeper. And it was only once that they were confronted with massive reaction to their land acquisition process that they realized that that gatekeeper didn't necessarily speak for the directly affected people. So you need to be very careful about kind of gatekeepers, particularly people within traditional or political, with political interests. Those people tend to have to deal with their own kind of set of competing demands, and politicians come and go. So trying to buy the goodwill of politicians is never a particularly a good idea. Sometimes it's a tempting thing to do, an expedient thing to do, but I'd be very wary of going down that path. Then again, you deal with traditional authorities. Sometimes you have power in Zambia. I mean, it's been the power of the traditional authorities there is deeply embedded, but then you have traditional authorities who have very restricted power, and Mozambique and Tanzania are examples where I think that's fairly applicable. You had the post-colonial government who essentially took a deliberate political strategy to try and diminish the powers of the traditional authorities, and they were fairly successful in many instances. So you have then traditional authorities who tend to be fairly cagey about their rights, and those rights aren't necessarily backed up in the way in which the government sees them, and that also creates potentially its own issues. Local political elites and councils, you obviously need to follow the protocols, and you need to be in a position where you are taking cognizance of them as key stakeholders. But again, you have to be very careful about how you interact with people, the expectations that you raise, the promises that you make, and that you understand the limits of their authority very carefully as well. And then access permissions, obviously individual land users and landowners, those access permissions are absolutely crucial, particularly within the context of the PS5, where we want to avoid forced evictions at all costs. If I have a lesson around this, and it's one that I give to all investors, is never reward bad behavior. It's quite often very tempting to look at entrenched aspects of a behavior that is, and it's easy to buy off aspects of bad behavior because it makes your initial path seem that much easier. But once you do that, you raise expectations, and you're creating a rod for your own back. And the real kind of issue, the real one there is around anything that has anything to do with corruption or bribery at all. Okay, Ben, maybe the next slide. Okay, I just wanted to talk very briefly about legislation in the IFC. I think Alexander did touch on this. Making financing and funder requirements, the IFC fit legislation is not always easy. Okay, those financing requirements are not negotiable, but government doesn't always understand that. In other words, they think quite often that despite the fact that you have a lender who has a set of conditions that they're imposing, that those conditions are negotiable, and it doesn't actually work like that. Government often fears precedent being set by imposing conditions such as the IFC's PS5, and they push back on that sometimes very vigorously, because it creates precedent for quite often their own projects, government-led projects, where if people are used to being resettled under conditions that are PS5 compliant, then where government gets involved and they're not involved in a project that has funding conditions attached to it that would be some either PS5 or similar, then they think that the people who are affected are going to hold them to the same kinds of conditions, and in fact, in that they have a case. Generally, what you do in order to be able to kind of respond to this in a responsible manner is to mesh the requirements of both the legislation and the IFCs, and you adopt whichever is most favorable to the project affected households. The areas where government most often pushes back in terms of the IFC is around the consultative requirements. Again, largely it can relate back to political preconsiderations around kind of political permission given, and government regards that as sufficient in terms of consultation. Livelihood restoration conditions, government very seldom is aware or equipped or prepared to regard livelihood restoration as conditional to resettlement. They see compensation as sufficient. Transition allowances, that's often kind of debated as well. Informal rights, talking to people whose rights are not necessarily embedded in a formal situation of land tenure or of access to assets, and we're talking about people who would be labeled largely as squatters, particularly. Governments very seldom are prepared to entertain the notion that they too have rights to compensation and rights to being protected under the PS. Vulnerability, it's not often something that government wants to consider as a condition under which resettlement should proceed, or special kind of measures being taken to protect people who are vulnerable. And then monitoring and closeout requirements is also something that they push back again. Compensation, though, on a more positive point, I mean, I think most compensation in Africa tends to be migrating towards replacement value or market value. So there is a push towards it being within the realm of what we would understand as the basis for replacement value. It's not always entirely consistent with replacement value, and I think Alexandra made that point that you need to actually double check that when you're looking at kind of government rates, but generally it is understood as a precondition for compensation that we do need to be looking at market value, and particularly market value in the context of replacement. Botswana had a note there, sometimes an anomaly in this instance. The last point I wanted to make there is just to be very careful of government managed processes and trying to retrofit projects where you as a developer or you as a financier have had land that has been made available to you, particularly land that's been recently been made available to you, and it's been delivered to you through a government managed process of land acquisition. And that leads into the next slide if you want to go across that one, Ben. When that happens generally, and probably 85 or 90% of the cases, what you're going to get is not a resettlement process or livelihood restoration plan, but you're going to get a compensation exercise. And that compensation exercise is going to come with all of those deliverables that you would regard as being necessary for a resettlement action plan, not being part and parcel of the process that you're being confronted with. So where you have it, there's a couple of questions that I think you need to go through as headline questions, and obviously these questions have underlying sub-questions as well. But certainly, I think if you're confronted with a situation where you have a developer and you're making funds available, or you are the developer and you have access to government-led land that is being acquired under government-led process, then ask the questions: was replacement value paid? Can we track the impacted households? In other words, is there a census, and is there a baseline information? Were those with non-formal rights compensated? Has anything been done about livelihoods? When was the land acquired, and how much time has passed? And I think you'd be quite often fairly shocked to find out that, you know, most of those are not in place. Ben, if we could go to the next one as well, please. Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about sort of census, valuation, baseline. So this is a key step in the whole process of the resettlement action plan, and those instruments sometimes become compressed into one. They sometimes become confused with each other, but they are in essence three separate entities, three separate kind of entities. The census is used to determine who is present in the project affected area, and essentially it defines eligibility, or at least it kind of points the way to defining eligibility. Within the PS, the census is linked to a cutoff date, so those present after the cutoff date are not eligible usually. But in practical application of that, you quite often do amend your eligibility after cutoff date, particularly using a grievance redress mechanism. So that quite often happens. Valuation then is the process of determining what assets are affected and applying a value to those assets and generating a compensation schedule. So generally it's a fairly straightforward technical exercise. However, in past projects, we have been made aware of tendencies towards that being used opportunistically for, let's call it compromised behavior, corrupt behavior. Tanzania, we did a review of a project in Tanzania that was funded by the Millennium Challenge Corporation, where they funded a energy access project in, I think there was 6 or 7 different districts or regions, sorry, in Tanzania. And of those 6 or 7 regions, when we did the analysis of the way in which the valuation had been done, essentially all bar one were inherently corrupt. And there was collusive behavior between essentially the valuers and the project affected people, whereby the valuers were essentially inflating the price of assets and then splitting the difference. And it became a major issue for that project. Ben, okay, if you want to go on to the next one. Okay, so your baseline survey determines the conditions of the project affected households. Generally, your unit of analysis is the household. So the baseline is generally 99% of the time it's collected at a household level. Strangely enough, the ERB uses the individual as the unit of analysis, not the household, but for the IFC and the World Bank, it is the household that is the unit of analysis. Baseline needs to be done extremely well. I mean, there's actually, if you don't get the baseline information properly developed, then you're going to develop a multitude of problems with your resettlement going forward. So getting the baseline done properly and done right first time upfront is actually of really kind of paramount importance. You need it for proper understanding of entitlements. You need it for vulnerability identification, and you need it for ongoing monitoring. And baseline instruments are not as easy to design as people think they are. So one of the things that you do need to sort of take some cognizance of is if you're going to do a baseline instrument, design it properly, spend a lot of time designing it, run it with a pilot study, pilot test it, do some data entry, and make sure that you can actually analyze the data that comes out of it, and that it provides you with the baseline indicators that you're going to need to do some monitoring. Baselines can be a sample. You don't have to do 100% of the project affected households, and I have seen samples, but you need a really good reason for it to be a sample. So projects I have seen we did a project recently in Uganda where it was for the IFC, in fact, and it was an overview, a review of a expressway that was going to be developed within the precinct of urban Kampala, and it was just impossible to do a baseline because it ran through an informal settlement. It was impossible to do 100% baseline, and we ran through an informal settlement, and the people just changed on a daily basis. So that was a good reason, not necessarily to do 100% sample, but otherwise I haven't come across too many other instances where it's you really have a good enough reason not to do a full 100% survey. Okay, next one then, Ben. Data management. I want to just make a couple of points around data management. Okay, managing data properly is absolutely fundamental to the rollout of a proper resettlement project. You need to have proper referencing. You need a proper system that runs as able to kind of cope with the magnitude of the data that you have in place. Certainly if you're dealing with a large number of people, I would suggest that if your consultant is not using a relational database, you should ask the question, why not? You know, I quite often see very extensive baseline data compressed into Excel spreadsheets, and there's nothing fundamentally wrong with it, but over time it becomes extremely difficult to manage that data. So generally opt for relational databases. It does maybe cost you a little bit more money upfront, particularly for large projects, but it pays off in the end. Data security is absolutely crucial. We have seen data being amended. Again, there's opportunism that comes into play where data is amended to suit particular trajectories of interests around compensation. So just watch that very carefully. Make sure that the consultant doesn't own the data, that the developer owns the data. You don't want the consultant walking off the project after RAP development has happened and leaving you without any data for RAP implementation or monitoring. And I've seen that happen on a couple of occasions as well. And have backups. Make sure you've got backups. Ben, if you want to go to the next one. Consultation. Okay. Again, Alexandra did talk about that. SEP up front, you need to do that. You need to make sure it's well developed. So you need somebody who knows what they're doing to develop the SEP. Make sure it's a stakeholder engagement plan. Make sure that it's well designed, that it caters for the magnitude of the risk of the project, and it caters for both the kind of the breadth of the project in terms of the numbers of stakeholders who be engaged, but also the depth of the project in terms of ongoing consultation, and it allows to be a living document. Again, inclusivity is key. Beware of gatekeepers. Again, I'm harping on this a little bit, but if there is one kind of aspect where resettlement projects do tend to kind of fail at the first hurdle, it's around gatekeepers getting involved and not allowing you access to people and genuinely exploring their interests in the project, stakeholders exploring their interests in the projects. You need to understand cultural dynamics. So for example, things like meetings, just make sure if you're going to have consultative meetings that they are designed around people's agendas in terms of availability. It's no good kind of if you're having meetings in the middle of the day and most people work, or meetings at night, early in the evenings, and you exclude women who have potential kind of domestic responsibilities at that time of the day. So be very careful around that. Understand literacy limitations with disclosure materials. Make sure that your disclosure is properly designed around literacy levels. Gender considerations of paramount importance, particularly within kind of entrenched patriarchal societies where you have, women particularly being excluded from the consultative process. Make sure that your stakeholder engagement plan makes allowance for women to be properly heard. And then watch for vulnerability division-driven exclusions. And there's a project that we were involved in a few years ago in Uganda, a large macro project, a pipeline, where in actual fact consultation was designed by entrenched gatekeepers to ensure that the vulnerable didn't have a voice, because essentially they had been forcing those people off of the land that had been earmarked, that had pre-sight of land that was going to be utilized, and they'd forced particularly vulnerable women out of that area and taken over land and represented themselves as the landowners. And it became a major scandal. And in fact, I think it is still going to blow up in the developer's face as a major scandal going forward. Okay, Ben, maybe go on to the next one. Sorry, I see there's a question there, difference between SEP and the socioeconomic baseline survey. Okay, the SEP is the stakeholder engagement plan, and the socioeconomic baseline survey is a survey that you would put in place in order to be able to understand the socioeconomic conditions of people. In other words, it's usually both a quantitative and a qualitative approach. You would generally run a survey that has a qualitative aspect to it and understand the sort of the quantum of people, and then also a qualitative aspect to understand kind of dynamics. But that's essentially understanding people's and particularly sort of directly project affected households, understanding their baseline conditions and being able to draw up a profile of people's baseline conditions. Okay, that's just an illustration of the types of kind of meetings that you can have, and they can range from all sorts of things, and each of those have their own kinds of dynamics in terms of engaging stakeholders. Okay, Ben, the next slide. Okay, I'm going to run very quickly through these. I've identified 6 of them, 5 of them, and I'll run very quickly through these because I think we are starting to run a little bit short of time. As I say, we normally have more like 15 or 20 of them, but these are kind of a couple of items that I've picked out in terms of nuanced, tricky issues or pertinent issues that tend to create complexity within resettlement planning. The first one is replacement housing. Ben, if you want to go on to that next slide. Sorry, I think it's the slide after that. Okay, all right, so replacement housing. There's a number of kind of issues. Most people think, okay, replacement housing is a pretty straightforward issue. People have got a house, or have got a dwelling, have got a structure, have got a set of structures within a homestead complex, and we simply kind of compensate them. We bring a valuer in, the valuer comes up with a value for that set of assets, and we've got essentially 2 options. One is in kind, which is preferred, and we can replace those assets in kind by rebuilding people's structures, or we can give them cash. In kind is preferred. Cash is not disallowed, but often auditors who come and have a look at projects where cash has been the go-to mechanism for replacing people's housing will want to know why that strategy was employed, and what safeguards were put in place around that strategy to ensure that cash that was used to be used for replacement dwelling structures actually was used for replacement dwelling structures. The reason cash is not preferred is for that reason, is that quite often, particularly in impoverished communities, people have very urgent cash needs, and once they have a windfall of cash, then they use it to satisfy or to kind of extinguish those needs. It might be things like urgent medical care, it might be things like school uniforms, it can be repaying loans to people they're indebted to, but the net result of that is that the quality of the housing suffers. So in kind is a preferred go-to reason. Quite often, in kind is also preferred by developers as well, particularly if they have time. Okay, developers tend to push against in kind compensation for dwelling structures when they don't have time, but because particularly developers who have a infrastructural project or a project that has a civil engineering requirement, they have those kinds of skills on tap, so they can design housing and they can use housing as a sweetener. Using housing as a sweetener or an incentive to persuade people to resettle is a double-edged sword. Okay, so on the one hand, it does create the conditions under which people become compliant about wanting to resettle because they offer this brand new spankingly sort of shiny house, maybe larger than they had before, but it also creates kind of the preconditions under which opportunism thrive. And quite often developers don't realize that those preconditions come back and bite them, but it also has pushback quite often from government who on the one hand maybe want to see developers being held accountable for producing these kinds of lovely sort of housing estates and that sort of thing, but it also has precedent issues for them. In other words, they might be held accountable to the same kinds of things. Those housing quite often is not necessarily entirely culturally appropriate as well, and even though they look good to start off with, they're beyond the means of many people to be able to maintain, and after a while they start to decay and people find it very difficult to be able to replace that housing. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword. Having said that, kind of if you do sort of take, and I've given a little bit of a sort of a photograph there of a house, if you do sort of take a like-for-like approach to replacing housing, it's almost impossible quite often to replace on a like-for-like basis. You wind up replacing structures that are inadequate in some instances, but also you buy into liability. If you replace a structure that is not a structure that comes with some kind of guarantee, in other words, it's a sort of a traditional modern materials structure, then once that structure starts to decay, and they do decay very quickly, then you as the developer tend to have a legacy, a liability legacy attached to maintenance of that housing. If you are going to go for cash, my advice there is try and go for some sort of self-build process and make cash available in tranches. In other words, allow people to build on their own, but make tranches of cash available to them so that people can actually use you can monitor the fact that people are using cash for the right purposes. Okay, next one, Ben. Tenants. Okay, this is something that's become a real issue in a project I'm working with in South Africa at the moment, where we have tenants. So tenants basically are, in other words, people who are in a structure that's owned by a third party. So you go to displace them, but you can't compensate them because they're not the owner of the asset. The owner of the asset gets compensated, but the tenant doesn't necessarily get compensated. And actually creating the conditions under which you cater for tenants is quite complex. We can't obviously leave tenants out on the street. You can't create a situation where you are responsible for adding to a situation around homelessness. And you have to find mechanisms by which you can accommodate tenants. The go-to is really to kind of subsidize rental for a while. It works sometimes, doesn't work in other times. Project we've got in South Africa and it's in the Northern Cape has created a real problem for itself around this, where it's developed a liability for tenants, and it's very difficult for them now to get out of that liability for tenants. I'm not sure how they're actually going to solve it in the end. It's a real problem. So if you have tenants, you really need to think very carefully up front how you're going to deal with it, and make sure that you have a plan in place that caters for people. It doesn't render them homeless, but doesn't create an unsustainable legacy for the developer as well, because that's in nobody's interests. Okay, the next issue, security of tenure. Okay, this also, it's tied up. Again, it's a project we did, the same project we're dealing with in Northern Cape, where it's got extremely confused around the issue of security of tenure. We've got civil society who assumes that people who are renters, okay, should have access to freehold title developed for them as per the rest of it. It's a very odd resettlement project. It's the only large-scale resettlement project I know of where the bulk of people were on freehold tenure. So people who are on freehold tenure, essentially they got replacement plots and replacement housing, but the renters didn't have access to that same stream of benefits. And the company is in a process of arbitration around all of this, where you have civil society saying those people should have been given RDP housing on a freehold basis. And that's what the IFC's PS is actually pointing to in terms of security of tenure. We don't think that's necessarily the correct interpretation of the IFC's PS, neither does the IFC, because we've brought in the IFC to kind of adjudicate on this, and neither do the lawyers. But still, it is an issue that has drawn itself out now for a number of years. Okay, Ben, the next one. Again, that's just a couple of other points that I wanted to make about security of tenure. Obviously, in terms of security of tenure, one of the things you cannot do is resettle people to an area where they would be subject to arbitrary eviction. That would be counter to both the kind of the IFC policy, but it also be counter to a whole series of human rights issues as well. So you cannot do that. Conversely, there's no explicit requirement to replace tenure that's not freehold with freehold, as we've been confronted with in this project in the Northern Cape. It's impossible, particularly in countries where freehold is not an option. But it also starts getting into that whole quandary of double dipping in terms of compensation, and something you want to avoid is double dipping. In other words, compensating for the same asset in multiple formats and in multiple forms. There's also, in terms of people being not exposed to eviction, this is quite an interesting case, and again, it's one that we were confronted with in Ghana, where people were evicted, even they were resettled very successfully, but were evicted some years down the line. Again, it's an MCC project, the Millennium Challenge Corporation. They came back and held the MCC liable for not conforming to the requirements around security of tenure. But once the closeout audit, what the closeout audit established was those people actually kind of abused their situation there and were evicted legally, both legally and also with the blessing of many of their neighbors as well. So it is that whole security of tenure issue, and non-exposure to eviction can in the long term become fairly complex for a developer to manage, and something you need to really watch very carefully when you're designing host resettlement sites as to how you deal with that to ensure that you don't have a legacy issue that confronts you later. Okay, next one, Ben. Vulnerability. Okay. All right. Vulnerability obviously is something that's really important in terms of understanding the way in which a project interacts with people. And the requirement here, boldly put, is to ensure that you understand natures of vulnerability, that you understand how vulnerability may be exacerbated by a resettlement project, and you take proactive measures to be able to identify vulnerability and to design a mitigation stream that ensures that people are not exposed to vulnerability, particularly to kind of further enhancement of pre-existing vulnerabilities within their communities as a result of resettlement. The issue there really is it's not defined in its entirety, or there are cues that are given in both the guidance note to the IFC's PS as well as the HB, the handbook, that does go some way towards giving you cues as to what constitutes vulnerability. Again, it gets back to that notion of having to design your socioeconomic baseline really carefully to be able to understand the depth of vulnerabilities and to be able to not just come up with a one-size-fits-all approach to mitigating vulnerability, but quite often coming up with multiple strategies that will respond to vulnerabilities and make sure that you deal with vulnerability within its context, and you deal with vulnerability within the sort of the broad range of people who are vulnerable, and have the appropriate mechanisms that respond to them. Okay, Ben, maybe the next one. Okay, autismal mining. I added this one again because it's one that's quite interesting. And this is my last slide. So, autismal mining, and I'm talking now about autismal mining that tends to be illegal mining, which is a big issue for many of the mining projects, extractive industry projects that go into Africa, particularly those that are dealing with high-end value products, gold, platinum, gemstones, those kinds of things. Interestingly, PS5 tends to bounce this kind of hot potato back to PS1, and it plays against a broader set of issues that has been hotly debated within the development of the PS, and particularly PS, this latest PS, the 2012 version, around how you deal with livelihoods that are not necessarily regarded as strictly legal. And I know that in the sort of debate that went around the construction of the 2012 PS, this was a real issue. And some of the early wording that was included in the drafts then got dropped later on, I think largely as a result of pressure from kind of governmental stakeholders. But essentially, artisanal mining and illegal livelihoods, what do you do about them? Well, essentially, you need to look at them within the context of a stream of livelihoods and a stream of mitigation measures. It's not necessarily tied up with PS5. In fact, as I say, PS5 largely bounces back to PS1. There is a bit of a footnote in PS5, but there's generally a requirement to have a look at livelihoods that are illegal as a set of replacement livelihoods that are part of a mitigation strategy based on alternative livelihoods, rather than obviously replacing an illegal livelihood with an illegal livelihood. Okay, Ben, that's from my side, guys. That's what I really wanted to sort of just try and talk about. I apologize for it being very quick, but it is I think, as Ben introduced the whole notion of the PS, it is the hot potato. It is the kind of the big sort of, it's the 400-pound gorilla in the corner very often, and it's very difficult, I think, to do justice just to the kind of complexity quite often that you're confronted with in terms of managing resettlement, both in the phase of development and the phase of resettlement. And it probably does require a series of more detailed kind of training sessions to really explore the items. But yeah, anyway, if there's any questions, I'll be very happy to talk about them, try and answer them.
Thanks, Greg. I really enjoyed that presentation. I think very insightful and kind of thoughtful points around how to apply PS5 when from the coalface and operating projects on the ground. So, I mean, a really interesting example. So I really appreciate that. I'm going to ask if there are any questions. I didn't see any in the chat. I see Malcolm said, I reviewed an oil and gas EIA conducted in 2017 by a local consultant in Kenya, which used 1998 census data. The EIA was approved by government. I'm assuming that's a comment more than a question, Malcolm, but yes, it is a concern about using up-to-date baseline data. Are there any questions? And if not, I'm going to hand over to Prav now, who I hope is still on the line for the final presentation of today. Greg, I'm hoping that maybe you can stay on the line for another 20 minutes, and if there are further questions.
No, I'm on the line. Yeah. No,
Yeah,
I'm on the line. So if you want to, also if you just want to, I've shared, I think my email should be available. If you want to shoot me a question, I'd be quite happy to kind of answer them in more detail in email. Acknowledge that there's kind of limited time to take things offline on these calls. So yeah, I'm happy to do that on offline as well.
Maybe just post your email in the chat so guys can reach out to you directly. I will also share the presentation later. Thanks, Greg. Prav, are you there?
I'm here. Hi, everyone.
Okay. Hi, Prav. I'm sorry to give you the graveyard shift, but I'm actually very excited for your presentation. I don't know if you want to share your screen, if you're a video person, or how you want to do this.
I'm going to share my screen. I've shared my screen. Can you see that?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Okay. So I guess the graveyard shift means ghost stories, right?
Ghost stories, yeah. Slowly plodding.
Okay, I hope I've got some ghost stories in here for you. So I thought I'd quickly cover from a lender's perspective what we would consider some key aspects that we would look for in terms of implementation of PS5. So starting from the left-hand side, minimize impact, looking at alternatives to avoid or minimize impact, which reflects what Alexandra was saying earlier, and that is to, as much as possible, avoid having to resettle or to affect people's livelihoods. And then, of course, to limit the project footprint wherever possible. So where you place worker camps, let me just kill this, sorry. Where you place worker camps, lay-down areas, or looking at borrow pits where you could impact on people's livelihoods or on their structures to limit that project footprint wherever possible. And then, of course, to use existing facilities where possible, for example, worker camps that we used on other projects so that you minimize the greenfield aspect of a project. Then in terms of negotiated settlements, one of the things that I've learned is to look at whether beneficiaries have had their own advisors. This provides some level of comfort for lenders that the beneficiaries understood what was being offered to them and that they had their own assessment of what the value of their assets should be. And then to consider the rates and processes that are used in other projects in the region as precedents. And thank goodness for the World Bank, who have set precedents in many countries that we can rely on as precedents for looking at valuations of assets and how crops, etc., are compensated for. And then, of course, as Greg said, ensure adequate baseline documentation and ensure that we have written sign-off from the beneficiary so that there is a record of those negotiated settlements going forward. Then in terms of baseline and documentation, very important to lenders is to ensure that vulnerability indicators are included in that baseline survey. We want to know that people have been assessed in terms of their livelihoods and their income, and that if they are vulnerable, that has been properly identified in the surveys, that cultural aspects have been considered, gender-based aspects have been considered, and that we understand what access these people require to resources and income so that if there is resettlement and people are moved, that they still have access to those resources and sources of income and haven't been moved in such a way that they now have to take a 15-minute commute over 4 hours, you know, and we've actually had an example where that's happened. And then, of course, the documentation needs to be at a beneficiary level. It needs to include, as I said, the survey, the asset valuation. We want to know what compensations were made. We want proof that the compensations were made and that monitoring visits happen with the dates recorded and notes recorded of those monitoring visits and records of any additional support that were provided to people during the monitoring period. Very important, cutoff date to confirm beneficiary list. Greg mentioned this in his presentation. We've had a project where a survey was done and a cutoff date was advertised, and then the project never actually reached financial close. And we're sitting 2 years later and we've asked for the surveys to be done again with new cutoff dates advertised so that we get a new beneficiary list. What's happened in that time is that where you could have had 50 people being economically compensated in a road reserve, we now have every man and his goat in that road reserve claiming compensation, and the number has jumped to something like 2,000 potentially affected households. Physical resettlement, the preference, of course, is that the surveys are completed well in advance of the construction of the project and that the housing is provided prior to demolition of their existing structures. But we have had projects where people had their existing homes demolished and had to be put into temporary accommodation. And a key consideration there would be the adequacy of that temporary accommodation whilst the permanent housing is being built. And what needs to be considered there is the length of time that you need that temporary accommodation, taking into consideration that there are almost always delays in the construction process of the new housing, that they have access to the resources that they need, and that their basic needs are met, and that there's good security in place for those households that are in temporary accommodation. And of course, that the resettlement action plan meets IFC Performance Standard 5. So we often would have a social specialist review the RAP so that we can verify that it meets the requirements of IFC Performance Standard 5. From a livelihood restoration perspective, we require proper vulnerability assessment, as I indicated under the baseline, and we do want to know who needs additional support and at least needs monitoring once they've been either resettled or economically compensated. In addition to a livelihood restoration plan, we do look for a vulnerable persons plan. We found that to have significant value in reducing risk to lenders, having that plan in place. And as Alexandra said, ongoing monitoring could go on for quite a while, and it's kind of been an accepted guideline to use 2 years of monitoring post-implementation of a resettlement action plan with quarterly visits or at least semi-annual visits, but preferably quarterly visits to ensure people have been able to restore their livelihoods. What's also important is that there must be an approved budget for that, and it must include the monitoring and additional support so that we know that the funds are available for teams to go out and monitor those people that have been resettled. And then very important is the capacity and experience of the implementing agent. And as Greg indicated, many of the implementing agencies, especially if they are government utilities, are not familiar with the IFC Performance Standard 5, and with the best intentions don't get it right. And recently, you know, from a lender perspective, we're now assessing the capacity of those implementing agents so that we have comfort that they know what to do. And if not, then we want certain controls in place so that they do get that capacity and they get the guidance and the advisors that they need to make that happen. And then again, of course, the issue of budget and having adequate resources in place. Safety nets from a lender perspective is grievance mechanisms. So we do rely on them being implemented and proof that they've been implemented so that, we have comfort that people have some recourse to raise any issues or concerns that they have with resettlement. It must be appropriate to the cultural norms of that area in terms of language, in terms of level of literacy, which is all stuff that Greg has covered. And that we do see the grievance register as part of the monitoring process so that we know that it's still operational and that people do have access to that grievance register over time. And another key control that lenders use is closeout audits. So having an independent consultant go out and actually audit those resettlement action plan implementations so that we know that materially it's met with IFC Performance Standard 5. So what can go wrong? These are the ghost stories. From an alternatives perspective, sometimes minimizing the social impact could result in other impacts. And so we need to have that sort of bigger picture view and that balancing act view that we don't create other impacts that become difficult or expensive to manage in order to minimize the social impact. So there needs to be that balancing act. And of course, we need to know that there are contractors who are not aware of the mitigations that are built into the ESIAs and the ESMSs, especially subcontractors, and they may not be aware of specific requirements in resettlement action plans, etc., and could then end up contravening some of the requirements built into those management plans. With negotiated settlements, when we're working with marginalized communities where there is a willing seller, willing buyer type arrangement, livelihood restoration remains a risk even after implementation. So we're recently looking at a project where some 88 households entered into a willing seller, willing buyer type agreement. They had their own advisors and land valuers. They reached they had quite a good process in terms of parceling the land and ensuring the right people got the right types of compensation. They used good rates. So in the specific province that they were present in, the rates were very low, and the developer adopted rates from a different province, which were at a higher rate. So it all looked really good. The question then came, well, if these people depended on this land for their living because they used it for crops, what are they doing now? How do they earn an income having lost that land? And there wasn't an answer to that. So we've now had to put in a control into the legal agreement for this deal that they will go back and do a vulnerable person's assessment of those 88 households, if they can track them back, and then ensure that some livelihood restoration has happened adequately enough for those people. Otherwise, they're going to have to do additional support and compensation for those people, depending on what they find. The thing with surveys and why it needs to be done so well up front is that retrospective surveys are very difficult to close gaps. People relocate, people die, beneficiaries, just disappear, and you cannot eventually close the gaps. We've seen on a linear project that some 700 beneficiaries that had to be documented retrospectively. I think we got down to about 400, and it's a huge gap for lenders to close off an IFC Performance Standard 5 compliance. And what do you do then in that case? How do you minimize the risk back to lenders on projects like that? The other issue is, of course, inadequate engagement with the beneficiary. So on the very same project, a number of people had actually moved because they believed that there was permanent loss of access to the land. It was a transmission line project, and they could actually go back and reestablish their crops, but nobody told them. And so some of them had to move in order to access other land. And in some cases, they were further away from water supply or schools, etc., and just, creating additional stress for these people. Physical resettlement. There's always delays in construction of the houses or the access systems that they need to get to work or to their places of income and meeting their basic needs. And this happens time and time again, no matter what the assurances are from the developers. Cash compensation really does not work well. We've had projects where people were given cash compensation and ended up in extremely vulnerable situations. So the picture at the bottom left was an elderly woman who was given cash compensation for her house. And when we had the project audited, she was found living in this kind of lean-to on the side of the road with no real shelter from the coming rain season. And the reason was that a relative had stolen her money after she received the cash compensation, and she had no resources to replace her home. So in this case, if there had been proper monitoring quarterly, this issue would have been picked up much earlier, and the developer would have provided her with additional support to help her replace her home. And this is, one of the reasons why cash compensation does not always work. On the right-hand side, the guy with the smiley face has leprosy, and he had to, again, he had cash compensation and was trying to rebuild his home by himself. He had about 6 dependents, and given his physical condition, he was unable to complete his home prior to the rainy season affecting that region. And again, it's placing people in already vulnerable circumstances under further stress, which is simply not acceptable from a lender perspective. With regards to livelihood restoration, additional support can mean different things. It could mean provision of seed or fertilizer to replace cash crops. It could just mean that good rehabilitation of the land that had been lost to those people, leveling it and providing them with contouring for crops, and then provision of other land. And again, it needs to work in terms of communal rights to land and making sure that everybody agrees and they have actual tenure or security of that land that they would need to use for their crops. And then, of course, there's access issues. So where there's certain areas where rains are quite heavy and they become cut off due to bad access roads, and you could have missed monitoring visits during the rainy season, and sometimes people who need medical care, like this gentleman with the leprosy, then aren't able to get medical attention, and those sorts of issues need to be addressed by the developer. And then, as Greg touched on, was unrecognized land use. So especially where you have government agencies looking at involuntary land acquisition, national laws may not recognize certain land uses, whereas in terms of IFC, we would require that those land uses are recognized, and people need to be compensated for the loss of income, especially where it's around using communal land for crops or to harvest wood, etc. So the implementing side, who is implementing? If they have a poor understanding of IFC requirements, this immediately makes it very difficult and is almost a recipe for disaster, because we do see then that the projects don't meet the IFC performance standards and that we have gaps and we have risks to lenders. There's language issues, there's cultural barriers that need to be overcome, and those doing the implementation have to be sensitive to those issues. And of course, again, the local legislation could be in conflict with IFC performance standards, where in some areas there are no freehold titles, but people need access of land for homes to be rebuilt, etc. We've had projects where we've had work stoppages due to poor economic compensation and inadequate stakeholder engagement, and a very simple project that should have been completed in a couple of months ended up being delayed for 6 to 8 months due to a work stoppage issue around inadequate stakeholder engagement and economic compensation. So closeout audits, there may be material findings. It may mean that we'll put in an additional action plan. We may require additional monitoring. We may require a follow-up audit if the gaps are quite large. To consultants, please don't give us lengthy Excel checklists and tables to work through. You can put them in the appendices, but we really want to know what the key risks and material issues are, so that those can be addressed with the developers. And just some control measures that we've started to use. In terms of minimizing the impact, look at the considerations that went into the development of alternatives. Did they consider the bigger picture and not just looked at the social impact and try to avoid people? So, for example, on a road project, the existing road goes through a certain town, and by widening the width and ensuring proper design, they would have had to physically resettle a number of people along the verges of the road. So to avoid this, the developers decided to reroute the route around the town. And this delayed the project significantly, I would say about 2 years, because the people in the town did not actually want the road rerouted, because they would lose income by having the road bypass the town. So just, look at the considerations that go into the development of alternatives, and just look at the picture, not just at resettlement impact. And then, can the project footprint be limited? So although a roads agency may want a certain category of road, but if you're going through certain towns, you may then have to look at reduced widths in the towns just to accommodate the needs of that town to have that traffic go through it. And then look at commercially sourced materials versus opening new borrow pits. It may look a little bit more expensive, but when you look at the resettlement of people or economic compensation for new land being opened, private land being opened, it may make sense to rather look at commercially sourced materials. And we've seen that on certain projects. So with negotiated settlements, like I mentioned, marginalized communities is a huge risk. And so put in place a vulnerability plan, ensure monitoring and reporting, even with the willing seller, willing buyer arrangement. And this just reduces the overall liability on a project. With baselines, we like to see an independent review of the RAP, and having a stakeholder engagement plan that can tick all the performance standard boxes. We also want to see proof of implementation, so that we know it's actually been implemented and people actually have had access to information about the project and have access to grievance mechanisms. One of the lessons that we've learned is that you do closeout audits as soon as possible. So in projects a few years ago, we would wait for full project implementation, and then going back to close gaps 2 years after people have been resettled becomes impossible. So more and more we are pushing for closeout audits to happen very soon after resettlement has actually occurred, in the very early stages of construction, so that those gaps can be closed as soon as possible. And what else? Yeah, so who is implementing? One of the things we've started to insist on is training in IFC Performance Standard 5 for the implementing agent, that they involve a consultant to advise and guide the agent who's implementing the RAP, that the EPC that we may be dealing with as the lender has a duty of care to us to oversee the agent's implementation process. And we're starting to think about where there could be partnerships with NGOs, so that there's some level of oversight to make sure things are done properly. And then, of course, our safety nets being independent audits, proper monitoring, and then when we engage with the implementing team, we talk ENS person to ENS person, so that there's an understanding of what the risks and the issues are and our concerns are. And then, of course, very important is that the legal documentation has appropriate obligations on the agent and the EPC with regards to all the IFC performance standards, but especially IFC Performance Standard 5. And that's my story. This last picture shows a transmission line project where, as you can see, the towers are pretty much built on top of people's houses. Nightmare of a project to have unraveled. Thanks, Ben.
Thanks, Prav. That's quite a picture to leave us with, eh? Does anyone have any questions or comments that they would like to ask Prav about her presentation and some of the issues she raised? I really liked Prav's point about, let's not go into the checklists in our reports, but focus more on what the risks are and explaining them in a clear and simple way. Prav, I don't know. Does anyone have any questions for Prav, guys? Very quiet today after maybe Alex stole everyone's thunder. Prav, thank you. Thank you, Prav. Really, really appreciate you taking the time to join.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, guys, so I know that we're a bit running short of time. So I think I'll do the wrap up now, and then we had envisaged showing a video. I will still show the video, and I will include some questions and thoughts in the chat. If you want to stay, please do. I know everyone probably has places they need to be this afternoon and things that they need to do. So please don't feel obligated to stay, but it is a very useful video of a resettlement project in a national park in Mozambique that actually borders Kruger, and about some of the issues that the project faced. So if you are interested, it's a 15-minute video. It's a very interesting illustration of some of the points that we've discussed and kind of some of the issues that can go wrong with a resettlement project. So what I'm going to ask is, when we show the video, Nomfundo, maybe can you pop some of the questions in the chat, and we can see if people are interested in having a further conversation afterwards, if people have stayed. I will also pop the evaluation for today's session in the chat. Guys, it's so important that we get these evaluations. So I will put the evaluation in the chat just now. I will also share it with you via email. I'm not now, unfortunately, I'm only going to share presentations from today's sessions with those people who complete the evaluation. I have to do a bit of tough love here, unfortunately, because today over 25 people have attended, and we need at least 20 people to complete an evaluation. I'm sorry to be pedantic. It's very important to us. Then in the evaluation, there is a very key and important question that we need to know the answer to. We would like to do the final performance standard session for this year, which will be on performance standard 6 on the 15th of December. Now, I know that a lot of us are going to go on holiday from the 16th the rest of the year, which is all very exciting. And we just want to know if you are interested and would be available to attend the session on the 15th. It will be in the afternoon. It will be about 2.5 hours. Nomfundo will be leading it as a performance standard 6 specialist, which is quite exciting. So please do let us know if you can make it. If a sufficient amount of you can attend, then we will run it. If we're not getting enough interest, then we will do it again. We'll reschedule it for January. So just please let us know realistically if you can attend. So I will, as the video is playing, I'm going to pop the evaluation in the chat. Nomfundo, if you could pop the questions that you prepared with Alex on the video in the chat as well, for people to think about while they're watching it, that would be really appreciated. And then a very quick 5-minute discussion about the video at the end. I am going to share my screen, which I really hope is going to work and everyone can see my WhatsApps. Okay. Can everyone hear the video and hear the sound?
Press play, Ben.
Okay, bear with me, guys, if I can just get the sound. I don't know how to do that. Just bear with me.
My responsibility is to project manage the project, present the donors. There's a good amount of donor funding coming in from Germany and France. So it's to ensure the implementation of the project is efficient and cost effective. Formerly a hunting cottada. In 2001 it was created. The Great Limpopo Transfrontier Park involves Kruger in South Africa, Gonarezhou National Park in Zimbabwe as well. The drier part of the park has been put aside for tourism, and of course tourism brings jobs, it brings development, and it brings investment into Mozambique.
Masimu ya haleni a ma ri makulu ene masimu ya haleni a hi nga na nsimu yin'we, hi nga na nsimu timbirhi. A hi ri na kwatiri wa tinsimu, mara hi ku kula ka tona a hi nga ti heti ku ti rima. A ku karhi ku fika mikama ya ku ndlhula xirimo ku a hi se fika makumu ka nsimu hi ku kula ka tona. A laniwa a na ha xivi nchumu hi tlhera mayelana na yindlu. A yindlu a yi ni pfuna ka hi swa ni tlela ka yona, mara ka sweswi se ni nga suka ni ya ku mali liya ni ngo ndzi ku nghena ndlwini ku a tlhele ra la no hleketa a tihomu loko ni buka byanyi lebyi hi byona byi navelaka ntsena para tihomu swifuwi swa mi ntsena. ka tiko leri no hleketa sweswi ntsena leswo ni navelaka swoho leswi ni nga fika hi tlhelo ra matshamelo ya ku ni tiva na ha vuya ni ta tshama la na ha naveli nchumu hambi vukati loko ba mahlawuli a hi tlheleleni leyi ni nga tshika ni a hi hambani mi ni sile we phindela le kaka wena hala hi nga kona la a hi hlupheka hi mhaka ku loko vabya a swi la hi fambi hi milenge ze ya fika ka makhaveni manjhe leyi wo huma ndlwini i nyima xitaratini kuma movha wu ku teka ya xibedhlele a ntirho ni nga ha vulavuli ntirho lowu ni nga ka wona mina hi vi mina ni nga vula swa ku mina se kwala ku ntsongo ni kumaku kona ni titwa ni ri kahle ni pfunekini na swi kota ku ni pfuna na vana va mina hi ntirho lowu ni nga ka wona
va vuyi loko va hlamusele leswaku la ka sukiwa la entangu leswi na swi leswaku hi nawu wa mfumo la ku fanele ku ve ku endla park se va ku loko mususiwa hi la hala muta yakeliwa majin'weni ku nga mulanga ndhawu leyi mi fanele ku ve mi ya tshama ka yona hi lexi nga hatla xi woka amitamu ya vanhu ku ve ni va pfumela leswaku na kota loko va ta susiwa la a vanhu
a li tiko la kahle ngopfu kusa a li pfundzisa loko na mpfula a hi nga karhateki lowu se lani na mati lomu hi hlupheki hi mati lowu ha swi hleketa ku fika hi byala hi ta byala kumbe misava ya fana kumbe swi ta huma hi swi tivi mara hi hleketa ku ya byala a mukanji wu mumangi hinkwaswo leswi hi nga byala tiko leyi
negociar é a conversa que ambas partes depois chegam a um consenso deles sair dando um determinado sítio. Não há qualquer coisa que faça com a comunidade sem negócio. É preciso negociar, tentar fazer entender à comunidade que quando saírem daqui, a vantagem que você tem é este, a desvantagem também existe porque eles já tinham habituado àquela terra, já tinham habituado muitas machambas, conforme estava a explicar, várias machambas em várias áreas. Então, quando ele pensa perder essas coisas, sente muito mal. Mas, de uma determinada conversa, de uma determinada negociação, ele chega ao momento de entender que aqui é...
navo nkarhi ku va jaha va byele leswaku a va lunghisi masimu ku va ta hi teka va hi komba masimu na hi nge se ta hi ta tshama le se kumbe va le ka swoho hi ta twa nhlamulo loko va ta tlhela va vuya hi ta nghena roni yavo makoku hi montori matele mara nkarhi montori u nga ta onhaka mati laha hi ta hlupheka hi wona lama nga yisi ndhawu
ya nga ta haka egasor
va lena
va ri hina leswi va nga ha tirha vo ku hakela vo se loko se va fambile va ri hini hi nga ta hakela hini ku hi nge swi koti ya fakani gezi mi tlhe mi hi faka a swigwehle hi leswi nga yela swona a hi kumani na vona kwale ka leswiya swa michini
se hi ku va ta hi yivela leswa swa tisolari va ta yivi ku se swi nga ta pfumeka munhu va ku swi ri
la hi le masinjiri
ko va na leswi ku hambana ka la na hala a ni ri kona hi timhaka ta mati a mati hi wona ma nga kumekeki ku olova se alani hi famba awara hinkwayo ra ku ya Jombeni se na swi ri ka ndzima ya kona leswi ku nga fika nyamutlha se va za va kota ku ve ni va hi rurisini halaya leswi nga fika nyamutlha a ku sukela nkama wa kona hi ma 2012 ku ta fika nyamutlha ku vulavula hi yona park hi leswi nga hi khomi kahle hi mhaka ya ku veni a ku rhurha andzhawini leyi u hanyaka ka yona swa karhata. Leswi swi fana na ximila lexi xi tsuvulaka andzhawini yin'wanyana u ya xi simeka andzhawini yin'wanyana. Leswi vula leswaku xi lava ntirho lowukulukumba ngopfu swinene leswaku swi lava i xi cheletela mati swinene ximila lexiya. Leswi swi vula leswaku hambi hi swo swi hi nga kona kokwana la ni nga kona ni kumeka ni nga hanyi kahle ngopfu hi loko ni tsundzuka le a ni tshama kona. Loko va ta nghenisa lexiya xa ku rima lexiya a ma fika 27 hekitara. Leswaku rima a masimu makulukumba funtsi a hi ri endle leswaku u tshika u rima ndhawu ya yikulukumba ngopfu swinene ku nga humi mavele. Manje loko ku hume swintsongo loko i sungula ku ve ni u famba u khipetela swilo leswi u khipetela a wu za u fika ndhawini yin'wanyana ya yikulukumba ngopfu swinene fika tata xileyi. Se u tlha u sungula fike ya ndhawu yin'wana ya yikulukumba ngopfu swinene tata xileyi. Se swi pfuna ngopfu porque na mundzuku loko mpfula yi nga ni mina ni ta va ni dya na ku pfuna vamakwerhu van'wanyana. Loko yi na khwatsi a 6 hekitari prawoito ya vanhu hi leyi kona yi daraku pra ku ve ni va nga dya a malembe mambirhi.
Se hala hi nga koho loko nga kumangi xaka ra ku a ku tanta ku yima la i rima la ene i twe ku lomba a yo va nsimu ya wena ku hatiko ra hina.
Swi nga fana na le a wu nga lawuli hi munhu laha hambi hi masimu lama a ni ri na wona laha loko a no tima na ha lava man'wanyana a ni ta tima na ha ri na man'wana hamba no lava 5 hamba no lava 6 hamba no lava 7. Ku na leswi tsemelaka misinya leyi basa nsimu a wu se rimi kuma mavele ya ko va teka.
Ite a va hindzi riverisang ya ku vhiyadera a tiko ra ka hina leswaku tihomu ta ka hina na ta ka makhaveni ti nga hluphi ku hala masunguni loko hi rimile swi nga swi rimi a swi endliwi. Se swoswi hivi hina la tikweni hi boha leswaku loko va nga se hi endlela swilo swa hina leswi hi swi lavaka a hala masungwini hala va ka makhaveni a hi nga ta va nyika. Loko ku fike guvernador hi swibalini na hi n'wi hlamuseli guvernador mina hi nexe ni n'wi hlamuselini leswaku va nga ta rima ndhawu liya loko va nga hi nyiki swa hina leswi hi nga twanana swona. Guvernador te inani va ta bula na vo lava park loko swi vulavuleni te va ta bula na vo lava park manje nhlamulo ya kona a yi se vuyi.
Vutomi bya kahle hinkwaswo a hi rima kahle a ku nga na nkarhi lowu hi sogolaka hi swin'wana na swin'wanyana swa mihandzu a hi ya rima hi minkarhi leyi ya xixika leyi swi faka swi ri koho matsavu ma ri koho mihlata a yi ri koho hinkwaswo leswi hi hanyaka hi swona hi swa vurimi a swi ri koho hi minkarhi leyi. Minkarhi ya ximumu na ku hinkwaswo a swi ri koho mahanyele ya ku rima hi tshama kahle.
Ni titwa ni nga ri kahle hikwalaho ka ku a vanhu vo tswaliwa van'wani va lava va ha kulaka lava ta kula va lava a tindhawu ta ku rima manje a va nga ha ti kumi wa swi vona. So a na ha ri na yona hikwalaho ka ku a xikungu xa ku rhurha lexi vuleni loko hi suka le kunani a hi nga ta yi kuma ndhawu ya ku ringana ku fana na alomu hi sukaka kona se a ku na makhwati lama a ma tshamini ma nga tirhi nchumu se munhu a rima a tlhama tsandzeka man'wana se manjhe laha a na ha ri na ndhawu ya ku veni ni nga nyika munhu hi mfanelo ya ku fana na leswi a ni tshamise swona leyi se kambe hi ku lexi xiboho xa mfumo ya hi le ripolo n'wina vakulukumba hi karhi hi hanya ku nga na maharihari hi poka lomu hi yaku kona hi ta famba hi ya tshama kaya swi tsakisa n'wina vakulukumba hi byela n'wina vakulukumba wa masava na masengeni huku ya bodi hi suka hi yaleni suka hi phahla na mbuti leyi na byala yi dyiwa mbuti leyi yi hela yi wuxiwa kunene hi tlhe hi ti hi vuyini hi ta fika la kaya hi phahle hi hetisa
I hope everyone enjoyed that video. I certainly did. I think it's kind of a very powerful illustration of some of the issues that can go wrong and that are very sensitive when it comes to resettlement. Nomfundo, I don't know if you want to just lead a quick discussion on the video before we close. I will just put the questions that you shared up on the screen.
Hi, Ben. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for that. Yes, I really also enjoyed this video. It was really interesting to see and hear from the actual impacted and affected people as to how they are sort of left with the storm at the end of the day. So the questions I posed, I had 3 questions that I wanted us to discuss, and we can easily just sum it up. I don't know if anyone would like to take a stab at these. The last 2 are more of an idea as to how you would, you as a consultant, what would you do if you had to be the consultant that was performing the due diligence for these, for this Limpopo National Park. So let me just see if anyone would like to intervene there, and then if there's nothing, Ben, maybe then we could wrap up. We could just, I could close off and wrap up.
Yeah, it'd be nice to hear 1 or 2 people. I don't know, everyone's been quite quiet today. So does anyone have any thoughts about the video, any ideas on the question? I can see that we have still 14 people on this call. So it'd be really interesting if anyone had kind of thoughts on this.
Yeah, it would have been nice to also hear from Craig, because I feel like he, if everyone was listening, he really answered most of these questions already.
Sure, we're getting a lot of silence, hey, Nomfundo.
Yeah.
Okay, guys, well, I don't know if we're going to get much joy. What do you think, Fufu?
I think maybe we could put the questions into the feedback form, or create like a whole other Google form for it and see what people say, and we could discuss it depending on when we meet again, maybe. have it as a quick
Let's
session.
put it in a Google form, Nomfundi, and share with everyone. We'll also share the link to the video, and then maybe we can also have a discussion at the beginning of the next session in December.
Great. That sounds good. It would have been really nice to have a discussion around this. It really touched all this case study really touched all the points that Craig spoke about. What stood out for me was the 10-year part as well, because this was a situation where people were moved, especially at the end, where people were resettled, and the chief wasn't willing to allow them to use the fields because they weren't getting the compensation that they were promised at the end. So that touched on that issue that Craig raised. So that would have also been nice to also hear from what people would think, how they would have gone about the due diligence process. That's really what I really wanted to get from our consultants, to know that they've been listening throughout the session.
Well, Nomfundi, let's commit to having a discussion about it next time, and then we're going to force people. Then we'll do it at the beginning also, when everyone is a bit fresher. How about that?
Not a problem. Thank you, Ben.
Okay, thank you everyone for your time today. I know it's been a really long session. It's a big topic. Thank you, Nomfundi, and thank you to all the presenters who spoke today. We really appreciate your time. I popped the link to the evaluation in the chat, and we'll share a Google Forms to add your thoughts, or a separate Survey Monkey on the video. And we'll be in touch. If you complete the evaluation, we will share the presentations with you. It shouldn't take more than a few minutes. Thanks everyone for your time today. I hope everyone has a lovely evening and enjoy the lovely sunny weather. All the best. Bye-bye.